Hollywood actor Johnny Depp thought it would be just another quiet night when he decided to take a secret walk to escape the chaos of fame. But what he discovered in a rundown house will shock you to your core. A child's desperate cry for help, a haunting mystery, and a life-changing decision. Stay until the end to see how this incredible story unfolds, and don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps stories like this alive. The streets of Los Angeles were alive with the buzz of nightlife as the sun dipped below the horizon. High-end cars lined the streets, paparazzi loitered outside posh restaurants, and the air was thick with the scent of ambition and indulgence. For Johnny Depp, it was suffocating. He leaned back in the plush chair of his trailer, staring at the pile of scripts on the table. A half-finished glass of wine rested beside them, its ruby hue catching the dim overhead light. The voices of his team filtered through the thin walls, debating schedules, discussing his next appearance, and strategizing his public image. It was always the same. Johnny had been feeling this way for weeks, trapped, overwhelmed, and desperate for a moment of quiet. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. Without a word to anyone, he grabbed a worn leather jacket and a pair of sunglasses. His assistant tried to stop him as he reached the door. "Johnny, where are you going? We have the—" "Cancel it," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. "I just need to breathe." He stepped outside into the crisp evening air, pulling the sunglasses low over his face and tucking his hair beneath a baseball cap. His clothes were simple, faded jeans and a plain black shirt, far removed from the eccentric outfits he was known for. This wasn't the Johnny Depp the world recognized. That was the point. He wandered aimlessly through the streets, putting as much distance as he could between himself and the constant noise of his life. The glamour of Beverly Hills faded as he walked further, replaced by modest neighborhoods. The perfectly manicured lawns gave way to cracked sidewalks and aging houses. The air carried a different kind of weight here, less pretentious, but tinged with something darker. Johnny found himself enjoying the anonymity. No one stopped him for selfies or autographs. He was just another face in the crowd, unnoticed and unremarkable. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. As night deepened, the streets grew quieter. He realized he had no idea where he was. The sprawling city had a way of swallowing people whole, especially those unfamiliar with its labyrinthine layout. He pulled out his phone to check the time, 10:43 p.m., and frowned at the dwindling battery. The map app struggled to load. "Figures," he muttered, tucking the phone back into his pocket. The neighborhood he had wandered into was eerily still. The houses were small and closely packed, their yards overgrown and fences sagging. Many of the street lights were out, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. A stray cat darted across the sidewalk, its movement startling him in the oppressive silence. As he passed one particularly run-down house, something made him stop. A sound, faint, almost imperceptible. He tilted his head, straining to hear over the rustle of leaves in the cool night breeze. "Help!" The voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Johnny froze, his heart skipping a beat. He turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing at the dilapidated structure before him. The house looked abandoned, with broken windows and a sagging porch. Paint peeled in jagged strips, exposing the rotting wood beneath. The front yard was a jungle of weeds and debris, and an old refrigerator lay tipped on its side near the curb. Johnny hesitated. His logical mind screamed at him to keep walking, to let someone else deal with whatever was happening here. But something about the voice tugged at him, A child's voice, laced with desperation. He couldn't ignore it. He approached the house cautiously, the wooden steps groaning under his weight. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the still night. "Hello?" he called, his voice firm but not loud. "Is anyone in there? Do you need help?" Silence. Johnny pressed his ear to the door. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting. Then he heard it again, faint and trembling. "Please, help me." That was enough. He tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. He glanced around the yard, searching for another way in. A broken window caught his eye. The jagged shards of glass glinted in the moonlight, but the frame was wide enough for him to climb through. "Okay, Depp," he muttered to himself, pulling off his jacket and tossing it aside. "This is officially the craziest thing you've ever done." He hoisted himself through the window, wincing as his hand brushed against the sharp edge of the frame. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with the smell of decay and neglect. His feet crunched on broken glass and debris as he landed in what appeared to be a kitchen. The room was a disaster. Moldy food containers and takeout boxes littered the counters and floor. The sink overflowed with dirty dishes, and the walls were stained with dark, unidentifiable smudges. A swarm of flies buzzed around a tipped-over trash can, their sound grating in the oppressive silence. Johnny covered his nose and mouth with his hand, fighting the urge to gag. He pulled out his phone to use the flashlight, the dim beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" he called again, stepping cautiously through the kitchen. "I'm here to help. Where are you?" The voice came again, faint but unmistakable from somewhere above him. "Upstairs." Johnny's heart pounded as he made his way to the staircase. The steps creaked ominously under his weight, threatening to give way at any moment. He gripped the handrail, his flashlight flickering as he ascended. The house seemed to groan around him, as if protesting his intrusion. At the top of the stairs, he found himself in a narrow hallway. Doors lined the walls, some ajar, others shut tight. He moved methodically, checking each room as he went. Most were empty, filled only with broken furniture and the stench of abandonment. But the voice guided him to the last door on the right. The door was locked. Johnny tried the handle, shaking it forcefully, but it wouldn't budge. "Hang on," he said, his voice steady. "I'm getting you out." He stepped back, bracing himself, and kicked the door near the handle. The old wood splintered on the first try but held firm. He kicked again, harder this time, and the door flew open with a crash. Johnny's flashlight beam swept the room, revealing a sight that made his blood run cold. Huddled in the corner, chained to an old radiator, was a small boy. His emaciated frame was covered in bruises and sores, and he wore nothing but a pair of tattered shorts. His head lolled to the side, his sunken eyes struggling to focus on the sudden light. Johnny's voice caught in his throat. "God, what have they done to you?" The boy's lips moved, forming a single word: "Help." The boy's faint whisper lingered in Johnny's ears, louder than the deafening silence that filled the dilapidated house. For a moment, he froze, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The sight before him was more horrifying than anything he'd ever seen in a movie or script. This wasn't fiction. This was raw, unfiltered reality. "Hey, kid," Johnny said softly, dropping to one knee. His voice cracked slightly as he tried to mask his fear. "I'm here. I'm going to help you, okay?" The boy's head tilted weakly, his gaunt face barely registering Johnny's presence. His eyes, deep-set and framed by dark shadows, reflected exhaustion and pain. Chains rattled as he shifted slightly, the movement sluggish and laborious. Johnny scanned the room quickly, It was barren except for the radiator the boy was chained to, a filthy mattress in the opposite corner, and piles of trash that reeked of rot. The air was suffocating, thick with the stench of neglect and something more sinister. "You're going to be okay," Johnny murmured, as much to reassure himself as the boy. He moved closer, inspecting the heavy chain and rusted padlock securing it to the radiator. The metal was tight around the boy's ankle, cutting into his skin and leaving angry red marks. "Let me see if I can—" Johnny hesitated. He had no tools, no way to break the lock. His mind raced, desperate for a solution. "Do you know where the key is?" The boy's lips parted, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper. Johnny spotted an empty water bottle lying nearby, its crumpled form a testament to the boy's limited sustenance. He grabbed it, shaking it to see if there was even a drop left. Nothing. He cursed under his breath, scanning the room again. Near the mattress, he spotted another bottle, half filled with murky liquid. It wasn't clean, but it was better than nothing. Johnny grabbed it and brought it to the boy's lips. "Small sips," he instructed gently, tilting the bottle. The boy's cracked lips parted, and he drank greedily, though his frail body struggled to handle even that. He coughed, a raspy sound that echoed in the empty room. "You're strong," Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're going to make it. Just hang on." He reached for his phone, his hands shaken as he dialed 911. The operator's calm, detached voice felt surreal against the chaos surrounding him. "This is an emergency," Johnny said, his voice urgent. "I found a child. He's chained up, malnourished. He needs medical attention immediately." The operator asked for the address. Johnny's heart sank. He had no idea where he was. He rushed to the window, peering outside for any identifying landmarks. Spotting a faded street sign, he relayed the information. "Help is on the way," the operator assured him. "Stay with the child. Can you confirm if the scene is safe?" Johnny glanced around the room, his instincts on high alert. "I think so," he said, "but I don't know who did this or if they're coming back." "Stay cautious," the operator advised. "Emergency services will be there soon." Johnny ended the call and pocketed his phone, turning back to the boy. "They're coming for you," he said softly. "Just hold on a little longer." The boy's eyes flickered, his body trembling from either cold or fear, or both. Johnny shrugged off his leather jacket, draping it over the child's frail shoulders. It dwarfed him, but the gesture seemed to provide some comfort. The silence of the house pressed in on Johnny as he sat beside the boy, his ears straining for any sound of approaching help. Instead, he heard a faint creak, the unmistakable groan of a floorboard somewhere downstairs. His breath caught. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Someone was in the house. "Stay quiet," he whispered to the boy, his voice barely audible. He rose slowly, positioning himself between the child and the door. His heart pounded as he scanned the room, looking for anything he could use as a weapon. His eyes landed on a rusted metal rod propped against the wall. Gripping it tightly, Johnny crept toward the doorway, his bare feet making no sound on the grimy floor. The house was old, every creak and groan amplified in the oppressive silence. He peered into the dark hallway, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. Another creak. Closer this time. Johnny's grip on the rod tightened as a figure emerged from the shadows. A woman, gaunt and unkempt, her eyes wild. She froze when she saw him, her mouth twisting into a snarl. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" she spat, her voice slurred and venomous. Johnny didn't flinch. "You chained a child to a radiator," he said evenly, though his voice shook with barely restrained anger. "What kind of person does that?" Her eyes flickered toward the room, panic flashing across her face before she masked it with bravado. "You don't know what you're talking about. That's none of your business." "The police are on their way," Johnny said, stepping closer. "This ends now." The woman's expression darkened, and she took a step back. "You think you're a hero? You don't know anything about us, about him." Johnny's jaw tightened. "I don't need to know anything else. He's a child, and you've destroyed him." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the air. The woman's face contorted with fear, and she turned, bolting down the hallway. Johnny didn't chase her. His priority was the boy. Returning to the room, he knelt beside the child, who looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "It's okay," Johnny said. "They're here. You're safe now." The front door burst open, the heavy boots of first responders echoing through the house. Voices called out, commanding and urgent. Johnny shouted back, directing them upstairs. Within moments, the room filled with paramedics and police officers. The boy was gently unchained and placed on a stretcher, his fragile body handled with utmost care. Johnny stood back, his hands trembling as he watched the scene unfold. "Sir, are you okay?" one of the officers asked him. Johnny nodded numbly. "I'm fine. Just take care of him." As the boy was carried out, his small hand reached for Johnny. "Don't leave," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Johnny grasped the boy's hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. The paramedics loaded the stretcher into the ambulance, and Johnny climbed in after them. As the doors closed behind him, the house faded into the distance, its haunting presence left behind. But Johnny knew the memory of it, and the boy's pain, would stay with him forever. The ambulance sped through the dark streets, its siren slicing through the quiet night. Johnny sat beside the stretcher, gripping the metal rail tightly as paramedics worked swiftly to stabilize the boy. The small space was alive with frantic energy, beeping monitors, clipped medical jargon, and the hum of urgency. But for Johnny, all of it faded into the background as he focused on the child lying before him. The boy's frail frame seemed impossibly small under the thin blanket draped over him. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale and damp with sweat. Despite the chaos around them, he clung to Johnny's hand with surprising strength, as if the connection alone was enough to keep him tethered to the world. "What's his BP?" one of the paramedics called, adjusting the IV. "Low, 70/40, severe dehydration and malnutrition. We need fluids in faster." Johnny swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the boy's hand. "You're going to make it," he whispered, leaning closer. "You're safe now." The boy's eyes fluttered open briefly, their hollow depths locking onto Johnny's. His lips moved, forming a single, barely audible word. Thank you." Johnny felt his chest tighten. "Don't thank me," he said softly. "Just focus on getting better." The ambulance pulled into the hospital's emergency entrance, where a team of doctors and nurses waited. The back doors flew open, and the stretcher was unloaded with practiced efficiency. Johnny hesitated, unsure if he should follow, but the boy's weak grip on his hand left him no choice. "I'm staying with him," Johnny said firmly to a nurse, who nodded and ushered him inside. The next few minutes were a blur. The boy was wheeled into a trauma room, surrounded by medical staff. Johnny stayed just outside the door, watching through the glass as they worked. They moved with precision, connecting him to machines, checking his vitals, and administering fluids. Johnny's mind raced as he stood there, feeling helpless. Who had done this to the boy? How long had he been trapped in that house? The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last, but the most pressing thought was clear. The boy was alive because of him. He couldn't walk away now. A nurse approached, her expression professional but kind. "Are you family?" she asked. Johnny hesitated. "No, I found him. He was chained up in a house." Her eyes softened. "He's lucky you did. We're stabilizing him now, but he's in critical condition. Malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of prolonged neglect. Do you know his name?" Johnny shook his head. "He hasn't told me. I don't think he can right now." "We'll take care of him," the nurse assured him, "but we'll need to notify child services and law enforcement." "Do whatever you have to," Johnny said, his voice firm. "Just make sure he's okay." The nurse nodded and disappeared back into the trauma room. Johnny leaned against the wall, running a hand through his hair. The weight of the night pressed down on him, but he couldn't leave. Not until he knew the boy was out of danger. Hours passed in a haze. Johnny paced the waiting room, his mind replaying the events of the night. The abandoned house, the locked room, the child's weak voice. It all felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Finally, a doctor approached, his face a mask of professionalism. "Mr. Depp?" Johnny straightened, his heart pounding. "How is he?" The doctor's expression softened. "He's stable for now. Severe dehydration and malnutrition were our immediate concerns, but we've started treatment. He also has several untreated fractures, likely from earlier injuries, and signs of infection. It's clear he's been through significant trauma, but children can be remarkably resilient. With the right care, he has a good chance of recovery." Relief washed over Johnny, his knees nearly buckling. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll be moving him to the pediatric ICU shortly," the doctor continued. "Once he's settled, you'll be able to see him." Johnny nodded, gratitude and determination surging through him. "I'll be here." The pediatric ICU was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the emergency room. Johnny followed a nurse down the hallway, the soft beeping of monitors and whispers of staff creating an almost reverent atmosphere. She led him to a small room where the boy lay, his tiny frame dwarfed by the hospital bed. Machines surrounded him, their lights casting a soft glow in the dim room. An IV ran into his arm, and monitors displayed his vitals. Despite the tubes and wires, he looked more peaceful than he had in the house. The fear and pain etched into his face had softened, replaced by a fragile calm. Johnny stepped closer, his heart aching at the sight. He pulled up a chair beside the bed and sat down, his elbows resting on his knees. "Hey, kid," he said softly. "It's me. I told you I wouldn't leave." The boy's eyelids fluttered, and he turned his head slightly, his gaze finding Johnny. "You came back." "Of course I did," Johnny said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I'm not going anywhere." The boy's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "I was scared." Johnny reached out, his hand resting gently on the boy's. "You don't have to be scared anymore. They can't hurt you now." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic beeping of the machines and the boy's labored breaths. Johnny felt the weight of the night begin to lift, replaced by a fierce determination. This wasn't just about saving the boy's life. It was about giving him a chance to truly live. As the first light of dawn crept through the hospital windows, a nurse entered the room with a clipboard. She glanced at Johnny, her expression warm. "You've been here all night." Johnny nodded, not taking his eyes off the boy. I couldn't leave." She smiled gently. "We'll need to get some information from you soon, and the police will want to speak with you about what happened." "I'll talk to them," Johnny said, "but only after I know he's okay." The nurse nodded and left, leaving Johnny alone with the boy once more. He leaned back in the chair, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. But as he watched the boy's chest rise and fall with each breath, he knew he'd made the right choice. This was only the beginning. The morning sun cast a faint glow across the pediatric ICU, soft beams filtering through the curtains. Johnny sat beside the boy's bed, his posture tense despite the calm surroundings. The boy had fallen into a fitful sleep, his frail body finally succumbing to the exhaustion and trauma it had endured. Machines beeped rhythmically, a faint reassurance that he was still hanging on. Johnny leaned forward, his elbows on his knees and hands clasped together. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What kind of person could do this to a child? He thought of the house, the filth, the stench, the chains, and felt his stomach churn. Every image replayed in his mind, each detail fueling his growing anger. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. He turned to see a woman in a crisp hospital uniform enter the room. Her expression was gentle, though the clipboard in her hands suggested she was there for official reasons. "Good morning, Mr. Depp," she said quietly, glancing at the sleeping boy. "I'm Lisa, a social worker assigned to his case. I hope it's okay to speak with you for a few minutes." Johnny nodded, gesturing for her to sit. She pulled a chair closer, her movements careful not to disturb the fragile peace in the room. "First, thank you," Lisa began, her voice steady but kind. "What you did last night may very well have saved his life. It's rare that we see someone act so quickly and selflessly." Johnny shifted uncomfortably, shrugging. "I just did what anyone would have done." Lisa tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Perhaps. But not everyone would have gone into that house or stayed by his side through all of this." Johnny didn't respond, his eyes flicking back to the boy. "How is he?" he asked instead, his voice low. "Really?" Lisa hesitated before answering. "He's stable for now, but his condition is severe. The malnutrition and dehydration are critical concerns, but there are also signs of physical abuse, fractures, untreated wounds. It's clear he's been through prolonged neglect." Johnny exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "Who could do this?" "That's what we're trying to determine," Lisa said. "The authorities are investigating, and we'll need your statement to help piece together what happened. Do you remember anything unusual about the house or the people who might have been there?" Johnny recounted the events as best he could. The voice, the locked door, the wild-eyed woman who fled when she heard the sirens. Lisa listened carefully, taking notes on her clipboard. "We've dealt with similar cases in the past," she said when he finished. "It's not uncommon for children in abusive situations to go unnoticed, especially in neighborhoods like that. But this case, the chains, the isolation, it's particularly horrifying." Johnny rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident. "What happens to him now?" Lisa paused, choosing her words carefully. "Our immediate priority is his health. The medical team will focus on stabilizing him and addressing his injuries. After that, we'll look into placing him in a safe environment." "A safe environment?" Johnny repeated, his tone sharp. "He needs more than that. He needs someone who'll actually care about him." Lisa regarded him thoughtfully. "Do you see yourself being involved in his recovery?" The question caught Johnny off guard. He hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead. All he knew was that leaving the boy now felt impossible. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not walking away." Lisa nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. That's a start. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a nurse who entered with a clipboard and a warm smile. Good news, she said. He's responding well to the fluids, and his vitals are stabilizing. The doctors are optimistic about his recovery, though it'll be a long process. Johnny felt a wave of relief wash over him. He looked at the boy, whose chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, and allowed himself a small smile. Thank you. The nurse left, and Lisa stood, her clipboard in hand. I'll let you get some rest, she said, but I'll be back later to check in. And if you need anything or just want to talk, let me know. Johnny nodded, watching as she exited the room. The door clicked softly behind her, leaving him alone with the boy once more. He sat back in the chair, exhaustion tugging at him. But every time he closed his eyes, the images of the house came rushing back. The chains, the filth, the woman's sneering face. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that there were still questions that needed answering. The boy stirred, his fingers twitching slightly against the blanket. Johnny leaned forward, his voice soft. Hey, kid, you awake? The boy's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused at first but slowly sharpening as he looked at Johnny. You stayed, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Of course I did, Johnny replied, a faint smile on his lips. I told you I wouldn't leave. The boy blinked slowly, as if processing the words. What's going to happen to me? Johnny hesitated, unsure how to answer. Right now, you're going to get better, he said finally. The doctors are going to take care of you, and I'll be here to make sure of it. The boy's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Promise? Promise, Johnny said firmly. The boy's eyes drifted shut again, his breathing evening out as he slipped back into sleep. Johnny sat back, his determination solidifying. Whatever it took, he wasn't going to let this child fall through the cracks again. The road ahead would be long, but Johnny was ready to face it, one step at a time. Johnny sat beside the boy's hospital bed, the steady rhythm of the machines a background hum to his thoughts. The boy was sleeping again, his frail chest rising and falling in a shallow rhythm under the hospital blanket. Though his appearance was still fragile, the pale color in his cheeks had shifted slightly toward something healthier. It was a small victory, but one that gave Johnny a sliver of hope. The soft click of the door opening drew Johnny's attention. A uniformed police officer entered, clipboard in hand, followed closely by Lisa, the social worker from earlier. The officer's expression was serious, but not unkind. Johnny straightened in his chair, bracing himself for the questions he knew were coming. Mr. Depp, the officer began, extending a hand. Detective Harris, I'm here to gather some information about the events from last night. Johnny shook the detective's hand and gestured for him to sit. Lisa remained standing, her presence a quiet reassurance as Harris flipped open his notebook. Let's start with the basics, Harris said. How did you come to find the boy? Johnny recounted everything again. His late-night walk to clear his mind, the faint voice he'd heard from the abandoned house, and the gut instinct that had driven him to investigate. He described the filth and decay inside the house, the boy chained to the radiator, and the woman who had confronted him before fleeing into the night. Did you see anyone else in the house? Harris asked, his pen scratching across the page. Johnny shook his head. Just her. She was wild-eyed, defensive. I could tell she wasn't expecting anyone to come inside. Harris nodded, jotting down notes. We've identified her as one of the residents of the property. Based on initial investigations, it seems she's part of a larger situation involving drug activity in the area. Johnny's jaw tightened. He thought of the boy, chained and starving, while the adults who should have cared for him prioritized their own addictions. "And the boy?" he asked. "Do we know who he is?" Lisa stepped forward, her expression gentle but tinged with sadness. "We're still piecing that together. He hasn't given us much to go on, but based on preliminary checks, it seems he may have been reported missing some time ago. The details are still unclear." Johnny's chest tightened. How could he have been missing for so long without anyone finding him? Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It happens more often than you'd think, especially in neighborhoods like this. People turn a blind eye, and kids like him fall through the cracks. But we're going to make sure that doesn't happen again." Johnny nodded, though the weight of those words lingered. He glanced back at the boy, still sleeping peacefully. The thought of him suffering alone in that house for so long was unbearable. "Mr. Depp," Lisa said, her voice drawing his attention, "I can see you've already formed a bond with him. Have you thought about what role you might want to play in his recovery?" Johnny hesitated, his mind racing. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't anticipated being drawn into something so deeply personal, but looking at the boy, he knew he couldn't walk away. "I don't know what I can do," he admitted, "but I'm not leaving him." Lisa nodded, her smile warm. "That's a good start. We'll take it one step at a time." Harris rose, closing his notebook. "We'll keep you updated on the investigation," he said. "If you remember anything else, anything that might help us find out who's responsible, let us know." Johnny watched as the detective and social worker left, the door clicking softly shut behind them. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The weight of the situation settled heavily on him, but he couldn't let it overwhelm him. The boy needed someone to fight for him, and Johnny was determined to be that person. The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Johnny leaned forward, his expression softening. "Hey, kid," he said quietly, "how are you feeling?" The boy blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused. "Tired," he murmured. "That's okay," Johnny said. "You've been through a lot. Just take it easy." The boy's eyes shifted, locking onto Johnny's. "You stayed." "Of course I did," Johnny replied. "I told you I wouldn't leave." The boy seemed to relax at those words, his small frame sinking further into the mattress. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the hum of the machines. "Can I ask you something?" Johnny said eventually. The boy nodded faintly. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated as if trying to remember. "Leo," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Johnny smiled. "That's a good name. Strong." Leo didn't respond, his gaze drifting to the window. "It was so dark," he said suddenly, his voice trembling. "In the room. I thought no one would find me." Johnny felt his chest tighten. He reached out, resting a hand gently on Leo's arm. "But you called for help," he said, "and I heard you. You're safe now." Leo's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away quickly. "I didn't think anyone would care." Johnny's grip on his arm tightened slightly, a quiet reassurance. "I care," he said firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Leo nodded, his small hand reaching to grip Johnny's. The strength in that simple gesture was enough to renew Johnny's resolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them, because Leo deserved a chance to heal, to be a child again. As the sun began to set, bathing the room in a warm golden light, Johnny sat by Leo's side, his presence a quiet promise of safety and hope. The sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the police station were a stark contrast to the calm of the hospital. Johnny stepped inside, his heart heavy with dread and a simmering anger he struggled to contain. The events of the last 2 days had been a whirlwind, but now, standing here, he was about to face the people who had caused Leo so much pain. Detective Harris met him at the front desk, his expression grim. "Thanks for coming in," he said, gesturing for Johnny to follow him. "We've brought in 2 suspects. One is the woman you encountered at the house. The other is a man we believe was her accomplice." Johnny clenched his fists at his sides, the memory of the wild-eyed woman flashing through his mind. "Are they talking?" he asked, his voice tight. Harris nodded as they walked down the corridor. "They've given statements, but you're not going to like what they have to say. The man is particularly defiant." The thought of hearing their justifications for what they'd done made Johnny's stomach churn, but he needed answers. He needed to understand how anyone could be so callous, so cruel. Harris led him into a small observation room with a one-way mirror. On the other side, the 2 suspects sat in separate holding cells. The woman sat hunched on the bench, her greasy hair hanging in her face. The man lounged casually, his expression smug, as if he had no care in the world. "That's them?" Johnny asked, his voice low. Harris nodded. "The man's name is Lucas, her boyfriend. The woman is Mary. They've been living in that house for years, off the grid for the most part. Based on what we've uncovered, they've been involved in drug use and other illegal activities." Johnny's jaw tightened as he stared at the man through the glass. Lucas glanced toward the mirror, a knowing smirk spreading across his face. Johnny felt his anger bubble to the surface. "I want to talk to him," Johnny said. Harris frowned. "That's not advisable. He's antagonistic and you're too close to this case. Let us handle it." Johnny turned to face the detective, his eyes hard. He chained a child to a radiator and left him to die. "I'm not here to be calm or collected. I need to hear him say why." Harris hesitated but eventually nodded. "Fine, but keep it under control." Johnny followed Harris into the interrogation room. Lucas's smirk widened as Johnny stepped inside, his demeanor oozing arrogance. "Well, well, if it isn't the hero," Lucas drawled, leaning back against the bench. "Come to gloat?" Johnny ignored the chair Harris gestured to, choosing instead to stand. He crossed his arms, staring Lucas down. "I came to ask why," he said evenly. "Why would you do this to a child?" Lucas chuckled, the sound low and grating. "Why not? He was always in the way, whining, crying, needing things. We didn't have time for that." Johnny's fists clenched at his sides. "He's a child," he said through gritted teeth. "Your responsibility was to care for him, not treat him like a burden." Lucas shrugged. "He's not my kid. Mary didn't want him around either, not when he started getting in the way of her hobbies." "You think you're some kind of savior, coming in and rescuing him? Go ahead, take him. He's nothing but trouble." The casual cruelty of Lucas's words made Johnny's stomach turn. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "Do you even understand what you've done to him, the damage you've caused?" Lucas's smirk faltered for the first time. "Look," he said, leaning forward, "you don't know what it's like. We didn't have the money, the time." Johnny cut him off, his voice rising. "You didn't have the decency. You left him to rot in that house while you lived your lives without a care. You could have called someone, anyone, if you didn't want him. Instead, you chained him like an animal." Lucas sneered, leaning back again. "You think you're better than me? With all your fame and money, playing a hero? Newsflash, you're no saint either." The words stung, but Johnny didn't flinch. "I may not be perfect," he said, his voice steady, "but I would never abandon a child, and I'll make damn sure you never get the chance to hurt him or anyone else again." The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. Lucas looked away, his bravado cracking slightly under Johnny's intense glare. Harris stepped forward, placing a hand on Johnny's arm. "That's enough," he said softly. "Let's go." Johnny took a step back, his chest heaving as he fought to regain control. He turned on his heel and walked out of the room without looking back. In the hallway, Harris stopped him. "You did well," he said. "We'll handle the rest. You should get back to the hospital. That boy needs you." Johnny nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Thanks, Harris." As he walked out of the station, the weight of the confrontation still heavy on his shoulders, Johnny felt a renewed sense of purpose. Lucas and Mary would face justice, but that was only part of the battle. The real fight lay in helping Leo heal and ensuring he never felt alone again. The early morning light streamed through the hospital windows, casting a soft glow across Leo's room. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the faint shuffle of nurses outside were the only sounds breaking the silence. Johnny sat beside Leo's bed, his fingers loosely clasping the boy's frail hand. Leo's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he seemed disoriented, his gaze darting around the room until it landed on Johnny. A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice raspy but steady. Johnny leaned forward, his expression warm. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere, didn't I?" Leo nodded, his grip tightening slightly around Johnny's fingers. They said I might have to go somewhere else." Johnny hesitated, his heart sinking at the thought. He had spent hours grappling with the reality of Leo's future. The system would step in, placing him in a foster home or a group facility, and Johnny couldn't bear the idea of him being shuffled through the cracks again. "I'm going to make sure you're safe," Johnny said firmly. "That's a promise." Leo's brow furrowed, doubt flickering in his tired eyes. "How? You don't even know me." Johnny leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "I know enough," he said. "I know you're strong. I know you've been through more than any kid should ever have to face. And I know you deserve a chance to be happy, to feel safe." For a moment, Leo didn't say anything. Then, his voice barely audible, he murmured, "I thought no one would care." Johnny felt his chest tighten. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from Leo's forehead. "I care," he said, "and I'm not the only one. The doctors, the nurses, Lisa, they're all here for you. You're not alone anymore." The boy's lips trembled, and he turned his head away, blinking rapidly. Johnny gave him a moment, his own emotions threatening to spill over. There was a knock at the door, and Lisa stepped in, her expression a mix of professionalism and warmth. "Good morning," she said softly, her gaze shifting between Leo and Johnny. "How are we feeling today?" Leo shrugged slightly, still not meeting her eyes. Johnny smiled faintly. "He's doing better. Aren't you, kid?" Leo nodded, though his movements were small, tentative. Lisa pulled up a chair beside Johnny. "I have some updates," she said, her tone cautious. "The police have taken the 2 people from the house into custody. It'll be a long legal process, but there's enough evidence to ensure they'll face serious consequences." Johnny nodded, relief mingling with the lingering anger he felt toward Lucas and Mary. Good. They need to pay for what they've done. Lisa's expression softened. I also wanted to talk about what's next for Leo. Typically, in cases like this, Child Services would arrange for temporary placement in a foster home while we work on finding a long-term solution. Johnny's jaw tightened. He doesn't need another temporary situation. He needs stability. Lisa studied him carefully. That's not an easy thing to provide, Mr. Depp. It's a commitment, emotionally, legally, and financially. Are you prepared for that? Johnny didn't hesitate. Yes, whatever it takes. Lisa smiled faintly, though her eyes were still searching. It's not something we can decide overnight. But if you're serious, I can begin the process of exploring what that might look like. Leo finally turned his head to look at them, his gaze shifting between Johnny and Lisa. What does that mean? He asked quietly. Johnny leaned forward, his voice gentle. It means I want to help you, Leo. Not just today or tomorrow, but for as long as you need me. Leo's eyes widened slightly, the disbelief clear in his expression. You'd do that? For me? Johnny nodded, his throat tight. Yeah, buddy, for you. Lisa stood, her smile more genuine now. I'll start making some calls. It won't be easy, but with your support, Johnny, I think we can give Leo the future he deserves. She left the room, and Johnny turned back to Leo, who was staring at him intently. You're really not leaving, are you? The boy asked. Johnny reached out, resting a hand on Leo's shoulder. Not a chance, he said. We're in this together. Leo's lips curved into the faintest smile, the first genuine one Johnny had seen since they'd met. Okay, he whispered. I'll try. The words were small, but they carried a weight of hope that made Johnny's chest swell. He squeezed Leo's hand gently, the promise between them unspoken but understood. As the morning light grew stronger, the room seemed brighter, the shadows of the past receding. For the first time, Johnny felt a sense of peace, not just for himself, but for Leo, and for the future they would build together. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. Together, they would find their way forward, one step at a time. What started as a quiet evening walk for Johnny Depp turned into a life-changing rescue. A child's cry for help, a battle for justice, and the beginning of healing. This story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope can shine through. What do you think of Johnny's incredible decision to step in and change Leo's life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep supporting stories that inspire and move us.